welcome back to another episode of Jerry and Rick Discuss Life and Other Important Topics. And we have been away for a while, but we've not been sitting around just doing nothing. We've been thinking about a major theme to which we would like to devote most of our programs for this fall. And it is one that really does affect life in many of its different respects.
It certainly does, and it's something that has been sort of creeping into our society for a number of years, and there's sort of a debate as to actually when it did start, and but it's all about civility and the way that we interact with people and that sort of disintegration of that civility and those conversations. And so we certainly would like to look into that. It's been something that we have had great concern about for a number of years and had some conversations in our offices about that. And so now I think it's time to expand it. It's really seems to be becoming a time when it is of much more concern.
And it's a concern on a variety of levels. Certainly, those of us who work in the media and who teach what we hope to be the next generation of media practitioners are concerned about the perception that the news media, in which the news media is held by the general population, and whether or not we are purveyors of fake news or the enemies of the people. There's certainly examples where members of the media need to do a better job. We would be the first to admit that, and we're trying to train our next generation of journalists to do it right, as we've tried to do with generations in the past. But it also expands into schools, it expands into private business, it expands into the church, it expands just about every facet of our society that we seem to be to have developed a much more polarized situation in our college or in our country at this point. And we are trying to figure out what, if anything, we can do about that to lessen that burden and to get more of us talking from a position of middle ground. We are still perhaps hopeless optimists and hopeful optimists, I guess I should say, that there is a middle ground that we can get back to, that we can reach, from which we are able to find some way to move forward.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we want to do is at least talk about solutions. And there are probably going to be people out there who say there are no solutions. There is no middle ground. I don't believe that. I think that there are ways that we can begin these conversations and have these conversations without them evolving into a shouting match or screaming things or calling people by names. It just doesn't help the situation. I don't think in anything, even though you can claim that from a political perspective that if you have a group of people who support you, who feel that way, they like that concept of hollering and shouting names and shouting fake news and all of those kinds of things. And it's, again, it just doesn't seem like it is very productive for our society. And it worries me if it continues down that path and starts going even more so. The divide in our country is going to be extreme, and what that will result in scares me a little.
We have, for generations, ever since, long before this country was even founded, where there have been competing viewpoints, competing interests, but what always seemed to make things work historically was that people of differing viewpoints could find some way to reach compromise and move forward, and that some of that started with the ability to have a civil discussion with one another and to say, let's just put on the table immediately where we differ, where our differences of opinion are, and let's find where we agree, and then can we find some path forward. Within the last few decades, a couple of examples come to mind. One is when Nebraska was represented in Congress by Bob Kerrey and by Chuck Hagel, who were on clearly opposite sides of the political spectrum, one an elected Democrat, one an elected Republican, and yet they were great friends and were able to, I sat in on several debates, as I know you did as well, where they would joke with each other, and it was clear they got along very well. They found their middle ground, at least so they said, in their shared Vietnam War experience and their thoughts about the military and protecting our country, and they were able to work together from that centrist view to try to get things done for the state of Nebraska. More recently, I've heard that Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was fast friends with the late Antonin Scalia when he was on the Supreme Court. Clearly, people of vastly different political leanings, but they found their common ground, I have been told, through a mutual love of opera. And they were fast friends. They would go to dinner together, they would enjoy music together, and it was from that that even when they disagreed with each other on policy issues, they were able to respect each other's opinions and move forward to decisions by the Supreme Court. So you mentioned, and I want to emphasize here, that we want to spend part of this emerging series this fall looking at ways of the ways that we got here. How did we evolve to where we are in this contentious discussion society? But we want to take it a step past that and ask a lot of people that we will interview over the course of this series, where do we go from here? Is it possible to regain some sense of middle ground where we can reach some movement forward? And we don't have the answers. We'll tell you that right off the bat here. We're not coming in here and saying, by gosh, this is the way to do it. But we want this to be more than just a, yup, things are bad kind of discussion, and try to move forward into discussion of how we make it better.
I like both of those examples, and we have talked about trying to see if Bob Carey and Chuck Hagel will come on our show. We know them both, and so we think that there's at least a chance, and I think that would be a really fun discussion. And with the Supreme Court, that really brings up, I think, an interesting part of this discussion, and that is the interpretation of information. And the Supreme Court is looking at a law, and you have very smart people on both sides of that argument. It's a different interpretation of the law. And I think that we have a real challenge sometimes in our country identifying facts, that we can all agree on, that this is an actual fact, and then once we have that, then it's the interpretation of that. And the example I always use, which I think is a great one, and I'll give a plug for the movie, it was a number of years ago, and it was a movie called Absence of Malice with Sally Field and Paul Newman. And at one point in time, Sally Field, who's the reporter, says, "All I want is the truth." And Paul Newman says, "Look, the truth isn't that easy to find. You print what you hear or what somebody tells you." And it's one of the issues, I think, with the media is that all we're doing is taking a speech or taking a tweet or taking something and then putting that into whatever our organization is, whether it's a broadcast or whether it's online or social media or print or whatever it is. And there is no checking to see if any of this is true, or we just put it out there. And I think that is one of the problems and one of the issues that we have with media. But again, the other thing is how do you interpret this set of facts, if we can even find a way to determine what this set of facts is and all agree to it.
And taking that a step farther, are we willing to accept the source of that set of facts? We're in a situation now where the underpinnings of organizations, fields of knowledge that have generally been looked at in generations past as the knowledgeable experts in this area are now being discredited as well, so that even people who may have made their life's work in researching certain types of law or science or theology are now just being told, well, but you're biased and we're not going to believe anything you say. So are we getting to a point, I had this discussion with one of our other colleagues a few days ago over the fact that there was a report released just this week that shows that involvement in, as defined by reading, viewing, watching, downloading news is declining has declined over the last year in almost every form of medium except radio, interestingly. And one of the questions that came out of that then was, does that indicate that people just aren't interested in the news, or that they don't trust the vehicles by which they get that news? And in an era where that could lead in some discussion to people thinking, well, we're just going to have a more tribal society where you get this group that says everything is green, and this group over here that says, no, everything is orange, and we're never going to even discuss it with each other. Oh, they're the green people, they're the orange people. And some people would say we're already there in some respects, perhaps with different colors. So we're trying to figure out, how do we get some blend of those two colors back again? But faith in those institutions that historically have been the repository of facts is being challenged as well. And so trying to define, in an era of alternative facts, what is the truth and what is not has never been more difficult.
And we're in a situation now. I was in class this week with, again, students from both, or all three, four of our majors now. I better get them all straight. So it was sports majors, it was broadcasting majors, it was journalism majors, and it was advertising and public relations majors. And it is a different world for this group of people as to where they get their information. Because I said, how many of you actually read a newspaper on a regular basis? And somebody said, I read them on Sundays after the Nebraska football games. That's when I'll read a newspaper. And other than that, there were none. So they are getting it from websites, they're getting it from their phone, they're getting it from social media. And I think one of the things we're also hoping to look at is how that has changed, and what kinds of ways does that influence the way people are reacting to different things and different sets of information.
Well, certainly if you're looking at the vetting process, that's being challenged in a couple of different fronts. One is the reduction across the board of newsroom staff members, and we just saw Nebraska's largest newspaper lay off a number of people as well and not fill a number of other open locations or open positions. So fewer people are being asked to do the same amount of work, if not more. That's certainly true in broadcast newsrooms as well. So that's an issue. But the other is the ability that everyone now has to be a publisher. I mean, when you and I grew up, we did not have social media. We did not have the internet. And so you had to rely on established media groups to provide you with your news and information, which hopefully was vetted, and quotes were checked and sources were checked and information was checked by, if not two, maybe three people before it ever actually saw the light of day. Now with the 24/7 newsroom philosophy and with social media, there's very little vetting in many cases of much information at all. And some folks will say, well, it's good that we don't have to rely on just these 3 or 4 news organizations because we didn't think they did a good job. So we're going to go out and publish our own stuff via social media. Well, good. Glad you can do that. We're all about free speech and First Amendment rights. But if there's either by lack of knowledge, no vetting, or deliberately there's no vetting in order to try to get a particular viewpoint out there, and everybody just goes, yes, I like that. I'll click the like button. I'll forward that. I'll repost it.
I'll share it. I'll do something with it. So, yeah, I think that's part of the problem is that I hope that we can at least have some discussions about looking at information and how you evaluate it and how you determine whether it is valuable or not valuable, or whether there is some semblance of truth to it. Where did someone get this information? Where is the original source of this information? Rather than I'm hoping it's true. I like the way this sounds, and so I want to agree with it. So I'm going to go ahead and spread this information, and I think that is part of our problem, and certainly something that we want to talk about as well. And then I think one of the things that we're going to have as a part of this is it seems to be a situation where other countries are also trying to manipulate social media and trying to manipulate information that is coming in to our country and
influence
how much
our conversation.
Right.
Yeah, and a lot of that is designed to roil the waters. That's been, I think we can all agree that's been proven. Maybe some discussion about where it's coming from and for what reasons, and whether or not it's geared toward one side or another or both. But certainly there's ample evidence to show there's been some monkey business from somewhere outside our borders, and we'll have to take that into account as well. But We don't want to make this sound like this is all about the media, because we're certainly
Right.
talking about civil discourse on all sides from any number of different aspects. And I also hope that people will understand that even though you and I work in the media and have devoted our lives to the media, that we are not apologists for it. We on many occasions have been critics of things about the media. And you and I have not had the same viewpoints on a lot of things in the past. I know we've had discussions, very spirited discussions over lunch on a number of occasions about, I know term limits is one thing we've
Right.
been on opposite sides of, but we understand each other's viewpoints on it. We're not going to change each other's minds, but we are at least willing to admit that there are legitimate viewpoints on both sides of every issue that comes up, and we'll do the same with the media. So don't expect this series to be all about how, oh, poor media, when our colleagues are getting a bad name. It'll be fair and balanced, as they like to say.
Right, and the media certainly deserves its share of criticism and credit in some fashion for delivering information and trying to do things in a very difficult situation. And some of that plays into some other areas, but you mentioned a few of them. We certainly want to talk about. We are at a university here, and so we want to talk about what's happening in education and those changes that we're going through. We have are very delighted that the chancellor of the university here in Lincoln, Ronnie Green, has agreed to come on our program. He's faced some difficult situations, and we don't want to talk about the specifics of those things and try to determine which is right and which is wrong, but we're looking at the overall perspective of just how do we have discussions at the university level, and the university has to deal with all kinds of things. They have to deal with the legislature. They have to deal with donors. They have to deal with athletic issues. They have to deal with what's happening in the agriculture industry. So there are all kinds of things and discussions that have to be had, and so we're delighted that he's going to be one of our guests and come on and talk about that, and perhaps to talk about how that has changed, and if he has some suggestions for some solutions.
Yep, the university certainly is one of those organizations that has multiple stakeholders, multiple masters, if you will, faculty, students, parents, staff, alums, the business community, the legislature, as you mentioned, but also the State Coordinating Commission on Higher Education,
Right.
accreditation bureaus, faculty unions, all kinds of groups are all weighing in on free speech issues and educational decisions. And it would not be an easy time to be an administrator in this
No.
university. So I'm really eager to talk with Chancellor Green about how he navigates these waters and what his thoughts are on civility and discourse as well.
And we're certainly interested in sports. We certainly have an interest in sports, and being here at the University of Nebraska, there are a lot of things that are going on, and so we're hoping to have someone from the athletic department somewhere along the line come talk to us. But we also have a really interesting guest coming up in the next few weeks, who is an investigative reporter for ESPN. His name is Dwayne Bray, who has agreed to appear on the program and talk about some of the issues that he sees that occur with athletics. And we certainly have seen a number of issues there dealing with women. It's certainly dealing with violence. And social media is a hotbed of activity in athletics, and whether that's good or bad, sometimes it's both.
Right. And we want to talk about religion, the role of the church and of faith in society. It's an issue where there are very heated feelings on both sides of that issue as well about how much the church should be involved in politics and government. Some folks absolutely feel that the country has declined because of a lack of church and a lack of faith in schools and in public squares. Others feel that no, the Constitution says you have the right to free expression of religion, but that there will not be an establishment of any one, and so it needs to be left open to any individual's feeling about that. So the First Amendment is one of those battlegrounds in that area as well. And when you have public officials who are quoting Scripture as part of the foundation for the decisions they're making, how does that play into lots of different things? So we will be investigating that particular story as well as we go, and hope to have a speaker or two that can enlighten us about that particular set of circumstances as well.
And we certainly do not want to not cover some controversial issues, and one of those certainly is diversity. So we're going to have some folks who will come in and talk to us about those kinds of things. There is certainly disagreement amongst the population of how diversity should be handled. Some people feel that they're given opportunities that others do not get, and so some of that civil discourse is not always at the highest level, and so we certainly want to talk about that as well.
Right. But we're also very keen to know what's on your mind.
Indeed.
Are there other areas and other topics of discussion that where you feel that the level of discourse has declined recently? How can we be more civil with each other? How do we get along? Can we all get along? And so we would be curious to know your thoughts about that as well. We'll make some contact information available on the page where we post this, and you are more than welcome to contact Jerry or me or both of us, because we would like to involve any and all of those kinds of topics in our discussion.
And one of the things that we're hoping to do somewhere along the line, so we'll put out a little plug for this, is to try and find some people who are willing to get together, who would have differing viewpoints, and see if we can look and find that middle ground to be able to have that discussion. And maybe that would give us some helpful ideas and tips that we might be able to pass along to our audience. So if somebody thinks that they might like to be a part of that group, let us know.
So with that, we'll get you thinking about that and encourage you to make some contributions, if you will, and to stay tuned for future episodes of the podcast as we get them up and running, and to then join in the big discussion, because we do want to hear from as many different folks from as many different perspectives as possible, because that's what's missing right now. I think a lot of people feel in the general discourse is the diversity of opinions at the same time in the same discussion.
You and I had a very interesting conversation a number of years ago when we were visiting France as a part of a depth reporting project, and we were talking to this young Muslim woman. And she had a very interesting point where she says, we have this one group who is screaming from one side, and we have another group that's screaming from the other side, and we never get to hear from these people in the middle. And those are the people that we need to hear from, and we want to talk to and find out what's on their minds.
And we still think there are more of those folks who are in the middle
Yes.
than get publicized. I'd like to think that the divide is there, but I'd like to think that it's not as heavily populated on each extreme as perhaps sometimes gets portrayed. I think there are a lot of folks who are very comfortable having positions in the middle and are willing to talk about how they make some of those things, reach some of those considerations or decisions where very heartfelt and sincere beliefs collide with one another, and how they came to a decision that they did.
Right. Exactly.
So, as we say in the broadcast business, stay tuned. We'll be back with more on this and many other topics soon to come. Thanks for listening.